The language of the inscription is Sumerian. Sumerian is the oldest written language. It's not related to any of the Indo-European or Semitic languages in that part of the world. Technically, that is generally known in the textbooks and among scholars as the Third Dynasty of Yu. That was a famous dynasty when Sumerian had a kind of renaissance. Before I die, please listen. Those were the haunting words of Samuel Noah Kramer, the man who spent his life decoding the world's oldest clay tablets. In his final notes, he hinted at something far greater than history, a forgotten prophecy buried in Sumerian writing. Kramer realized the ancients were not just recording events, they were creating them. And hidden in those tablets was a flood story that could rewrite everything we know about civilization itself. Let's go. The man who rewrote ancient history. In a quiet Philadelphia library, a frail man once whispered, "Before I die, please listen." His name was Samuel Noah Kramer, and he had spent more than half a century piecing together the forgotten voices of the world's first civilization, the Sumerians. By the time he died in 1990, Kramer had translated more ancient texts than any other human being alive. Yet in his final notebooks, he suggested that he had uncovered something extraordinary. It was a pattern running through Sumerian hymns, laws, and myths, suggesting that the Great Flood was actually part of a crucially important belief system. So what did Kramer find hidden in those ancient lines? Samuel Noah Kramer was born in 1897 in what is now Ukraine to Jewish parents who fled pogroms and settled in Philadelphia when he was still a child. He grew up speaking Russian, Yiddish, and English, and discovered Assyriology, which is the term used to refer to the study of ancient Mesopotamia, almost by accident while studying at the University of Pennsylvania. An interesting fact to note is that his interest began with these strange wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets that no one had read for thousands of years. After earning his PhD in 1929, Kramer began his lifelong obsession, which was to recover and translate the voices of Sumer. For most of his life, he worked in the Pen Museum, surrounded by cabinets filled with clay fragments, often spending 10 or 12 hours a day matching broken signs by eye, line by line, until a story emerged. By the 1950s, Kramer had published a series of incredible translations that transformed how we understood ancient history. His most famous work, History Begins at Sumer, listed 39 firsts in human civilization. This includes the first schools, the first written laws, the first moral debates, the first recorded dream, even the first case of teenage rebellion. To the public, he became the academic who allowed modern people a chance to study the dawn of humanity. But among scholars, his reputation was complicated. He was often met with disagreement on the deeper philosophical conclusions he sometimes drew, that the Sumerians had encoded their worldview into their language in a way that later cultures unconsciously inherited. Kramer's career followed the same arc as the civilization he studied. From discovery to mastery to concern, his early work focused on translation and classification. His middle years were devoted to synthesis, like in linking myths to historical realities. But in his final decades, he became occupied with patterns he couldn't quite explain. This was recurring phrases, ritual numbers, architectural blueprints that mirrored celestial diagrams. He began to wonder whether Sumerian writing, religion, and administration were not separate disciplines, but instead expressing a single connected logic, almost like a cosmic accounting system that kept gods, kings, and ordinary citizens bound in harmony. To understand why that idea was so radical, we have to understand what Sumer was. Around 4000 BCE, CE long before the pyramids of Egypt or the cities of China, the flat alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers began to sprout the world's first urban centers. Cities like Uruk, Nippur, and Gweru rose from the mud. These were networks of temples, canals, and storage halls built on land so fertile that grain could sustain massive populations. Each city was its own small world ruled by priest-kings who claimed that they were favored by the gods and they measured time by the floods and the stars. Around 2100 BCE, during what historians call the Second Period, all of these city-states were united under a bureaucratic empire that left behind tens of thousands of clay tablets. These included receipts, rations, and building logs. Those unassuming marks made with a stylus pressed into wet clay are what we now call cuneiform, which comes from the Latin word for wedge. At its origin, cuneiform was a simple accounting tool, a way to keep track of goats, barley, or silver. But over centuries, the marks became more complex, evolving into a script capable of recording myth, law, and philosophy. To write was no longer to count. It was to create meaning. And this is what fascinated Kramer. The moment when writing stopped being a mirror of reality and began shaping it. He noticed how administrative records and religious hymns used the same phrases like to raise the pure mountain or to bind heaven and earth. It was almost like the act of inscription itself was part of a ritual. For the Sumerians, writing was divine order. This is also why Summa matters, for modernity. Almost everything we associate with civilization, like cities, laws, taxes, literature, calendars, kingship, even organized religion, begins here. The Sumerians invented the bureaucratic logic that underlies empires, the written contracts that sustain economies, and the symbolic systems that still shape our politics and beliefs. Every form you fill out, every contract you sign, every law you read traces a faint lineage back to those first wedges of clay. The Sumerians taught humanity how to make thought permanent, and in doing so, how to make power last. Kramer spent his life chasing the origins of that permanence. Or in other words, the moment humanity first realized that language could outlive its speaker. In the process, he became haunted by the idea that these ancient texts were like blueprints of human consciousness. What if our systems of law, religion, and order are still operating on the same logic that began 5,000 years ago in the floodplains of Sumer? What if the Great Flood story, the one we think we already know, was only the surface of a much deeper code? The discovery that changed everything. The phrase appeared again and again in temple dedications, in royal inscriptions, even in lists of construction materials to raise the pure mountain and bind heaven and earth. Now, in early 2025, a new wave of archaeological discoveries forced researchers to look again. Hidden within tens of thousands of clay tablets, a repeating pattern emerged. The same sequence of signs replicated across bureaucratic records, legal contracts, and religious hymns. As if every transaction, every prayer, every brick laid for a temple carried the same encoded instruction. Could it be that the Sumerians didn't just write about creation? They were performing it line by line. The story begins with one of the most haunting observations Samuel Noah Kramer ever made. While cataloging a batch of temple texts from the city of Nippur in the 1950s, he noticed this recurring phrase about raising the pure mountain and binding heaven and earth. It appeared in myths describing the gods' creation of order, but also in records that had no religious purpose whatsoever, like grain rations, trade tallies, and lists of workers. Kramer was confused and couldn't find an answer to why the same cosmic phrase would appear in an account book. For years, he jotted it down in the margins of his notes, convinced it meant something more. But he couldn't prove it with the tools of his time. But today, nearly 70 years later, that same phrase has become the key to a digital discovery no one saw coming. In the last few years, the site of Gyarsu, an ancient Sumerian city in modern-day Iraq, has undergone a dramatic transformation thanks to high-resolution drone mapping, LAR scans, and stratigraphic excavation. Actually, Gyarsu was one of the main administrative centers of the third period around 2100 BCE, a time when bureaucratic control reached extraordinary precision. And now archaeologists recently uncovered over 20,000 new tablets, many of them perfectly preserved because they were baked accidentally in ancient fires. These tablets revealed a breathtaking level of organization, where every aspect of life was inscribed. This included all from the weights of livestock to the lengths of riverbanks, from daily temple offerings to the precise timing of festivals. At first, this seemed like standard administrative fare, but as digital imaging teams began scanning the tablets in bulk, something unusual appeared. The same sequences of cuneiform signs, long assumed to be formulaic phrases or scribal conventions, were turning up across vastly different genres of text. A line describing the dedication of a temple, for instance, would share an identical structure with a line documenting the delivery of grain. When these sequences were mapped onto three-dimensional reconstructions of buildings and rituals, the overlap raised concerns. What made this discovery revolutionary was the technology that enabled it. Using a combination of CT scanning, multispectral imaging, and machine learning pattern recognition, teams at the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania were able to digitally unwrap tablets that had been too fragile to read, which was a groundbreaking new technology. These systems then compared the signs across thousands of entries simultaneously, a task no human scholar could ever accomplish. The algorithms began to flag repeating clusters of signs that appeared statistically more often than random chance would allow. Among the most frequent was a phrase equivalent to "raise the pure mountain," but it wasn't confined to temple hymns. It was found in records of labor assignments, shipping manifests, and construction tallies. This is an explosive revelation because it suggests that the act of building, counting, and writing were part of the same sacred framework. Every time a scribe recorded the number of bricks used in a temple wall, they were noting inventory. But much more significantly, they were also symbolically raising the pure mountain. In other words, they participated in a divine process that united heaven and earth through bureaucratic precision. For decades, scholars dismissed Kramer's intuition that Sumerian writing carried hidden layers of ritual meaning. It sounded mystical, even unscientific. But now AI has given us a way to test that intuition quantitatively by running frequency analyses on tens of thousands of lines. Researchers found that certain ritual expressions like binding heaven and earth, making firm the foundation, and establishing the holy order recur at statistically significant rates in administrative documents where they seemingly don't belong. Even more strikingly, these phrases often appear at structurally identical points within the text, such as at the start or end of an entry, or at transitions between accounting categories. This means they were intentional. The scribes who wrote them may have believed that inscribing these words maintained the cosmic balance between divine order and earthly activity. If you're wondering why this is such a sensational discovery, the answer is because it challenges one of the core assumptions of modern archaeology. That early writing evolved purely for economic administration. The new evidence suggests something far deeper, that writing itself was part of key rituals. That language had power not only to record, but to enact divine order as olden civilizations thought. What if the act of documenting was itself a sacred responsibility? What if the accountants logging grain deliveries thought themselves to be participating in the same creative cycle that began with the flood and the gods' reestablishment of order? Recent data visualization from the Gersu project supports this finding. It shows dense networks of cross-referencing phrases connecting economic and religious archives, and some even follow astronomical alignments. Temple construction records mention binding heaven and earth during the same lunar phases as hymns describing the god Enlil fixing the bonds of heaven. Statistically, the overlap is too precise to be coincidence, as the administrative system itself was synchronized with celestial and ritual cycles. It's no wonder that historians are now calling this discovery a new paradigm for understanding early writing. When we look back at Kramer's old notebooks filled with lines of transliteration and frustrated marginalia, we can see the beginnings of this realization. He suspected that the boundary between myth and management didn't exist for the Sumerians. The same hand that wrote the hymns of creation also recorded the daily barley quotas. To them, both acts were sacred, both necessary to sustain the universe. Today, digital tools are allowing us to see what Kramer could only sense. With the power to analyze every known Sumerian text at once, we can finally observe how entire linguistic systems reflected theological and administrative unity. Scholars are now building visual maps showing how key ritual phrases migrate between genres, spreading like neural pathways through the body of Sumerian civilization. The result is astonishing. A living network of ideas, a language system designed not only to describe the world, but to continuously renew it through repetition. And here's the deeper implication, one that has left even seasoned archaeologists uneasy. If the Sumerians believed that writing maintained the cosmos, then the Great Flood narrative, which they were the first to record, wasn't just a story of destruction and rebirth. It was a warning as it marked the point where divine communication was broken, where the sacred link between language and order collapsed, and where humanity had to begin again by re-establishing that connection through writing. So what does this mean for us today? The discovery forces us to reconsider what writing truly does. It may not only preserve thought, it may generate it. The same recursive logic that powered the Sumerian temples underlies our own data systems, our algorithms, our bureaucracies. We are still, in a sense, binding heaven and earth through code and record, trying to stabilize a world that constantly threatens to dissolve into chaos. Kramer once wrote that the greatest tragedy of scholarship is that we can hear the voice of the Sumerian scribe, but we cannot answer him. Now, with these new tools, we finally can. The sentences that wouldn't die. When scholars began to re-examine the thousands of tablets from sites like Nippur and Gyarsu, they realized that these recurring sentences were not isolated curiosities. As they appeared in temple hymns, in royal inscriptions celebrating new ziggurats, in ration lists for laborers, and even in contracts recording the delivery of grain or copper. This means that what began as ordinary bureaucratic language slowly began to carry the message of the god's intent. In a religious hymn to raise the pure mountain, described the god's creation of the sacred temple. In a building record, the same phrase marked the laying of foundations. In a ledger, it might introduce the first entry of materials dedicated to the project. In one temple hymn from Nippur, a line reads, "May the temple's base be firm as the deep. May its peak join the sky." That same pattern, slightly altered, turns up in a logbook recording the delivery of mud bricks. To Kramer, it was evidence of a civilization embedding its system of religion into daily practice, writing the act of creation into every transaction. The more texts scholars compared, the clearer the pattern became. Phrases like "to make pure the foundation," "to bind the bond of heaven and earth," and "to measure with the sacred cord" appeared in both religious and administrative texts. These were structured repetitions that followed rules. And working alongside these repetitions was a system of sacred numbers that the Sumerians considered essential to the balance of the universe. The numbers 3, 7, 12, and 60 appear everywhere in Sumerian texts. They are woven into offerings, architectural proportions, and sequences of ritual actions. 3 symbolized completeness, often used in triads of gods or threefold blessings. 7 represented the cosmic totality, the completion of a cycle. 12 tied to the calendar and celestial order, while 60, the base of their sexagesimal system, embodied total perfection. This means that every act of measurement, every calculation on a clay tablet, was not only practical but also spiritual. A ration list might be divided in units of 60, whereas a temple might require 7 offerings, or a construction log might repeat an instruction 3 times. Modern researchers can now trace these patterns across entire archives because of advances in computational linguistics. By digitizing thousands of tablets, scholars can identify formulaic clusters of words that appear statistically more often than chance would allow. In the past, Kramer's method depended on intuition and memory. He would recognize a familiar turn of phrase after years of reading. Today, algorithms can do the same across hundreds of thousands of lines of text. This discovery reshapes our understanding of why writing was invented in the first place. For a long time, scholars thought writing began as a practical tool for managing resources, grain, livestock, labor. But these new findings suggest that from the very start, writing carried a dual purpose: to record and to invoke the sacred order. One of the most striking examples comes from Gearsu, where new tablets unearthed in the past few years record temple construction orders. In several, the same line appears at the start: "May the god Enlil make firm the foundation." That phrase appears in contracts allocating materials, inspection notes, and even in work rosters. To write was to build, and to build was to participate in creation. But how do scholars determine which repetitions are meaningful and which are just linguistic habits? Well, they use a combination of old and new scientific methods to achieve this. Paleography, the study of handwriting styles, helps date and locate tablets, allowing comparisons within time periods. Lexical concordances organize known Sumerian words by frequency and context. And now machine learning models trained on these databases can identify unexpected crossovers between categories. When a ritual formula suddenly appears in a trade record, for instance, the program flags it for closer inspection. This means that what once took decades of manual collation can now be done in weeks, producing insights Kramer could only have dreamed of. Still, scholars remain careful about what these patterns mean. Some believe the repeated phrases might just show how scribes were trained, not that they held deep religious meaning. Students copied the same modeled texts again and again, so certain lines could have spread simply through practice. But others point out that the same powerful symbols appear over many centuries, which seems too intentional to be random. The debate continues, but everyone agrees on one thing. Sumerian writing was not mechanical. It was alive, rhythmic, and full of meaning. The ziggurat is a huge temple that seemed to rise out of the flat desert like a mountain. Kramer began to wonder, what if the ziggurat was not just a building? What if it was a kind of three-dimensional text expressing the same ideas he had seen written in the Sumerian tablets? When he studied the records from Kramer noticed that the language describing the ziggurat's construction was almost identical to the phrases found in Sumerian hymns and religious writings. The ziggurat of was dedicated to the moon god Nana and was built during the reign of King Namu around 2,100 years before the Common Era. But it was later restored by King Nabonidus about 15 centuries afterward. The temple rose high above the plains of southern Mesopotamia, made from millions of mud bricks, baked hard in the sun, and stacked in giant layers or terraces. and at the top stood a small shrine where priests and rulers could offer sacrifices and prayers to Nana. The base of the ziggurat measured over 60 meters on each side, and it once stood about 30 meters tall, roughly the height of a 10-story modern building. But the importance of the ziggurat was not only in its size or engineering skill, it was a symbol of how the Sumerians understood the universe. Each of its terraces represented one level of existence. The ground below was the human world. The middle layers symbolized the realm between, and the upper shrine represented the heavens. Climbing the ziggurat was more than a physical act. It was a ritual journey that reenacted the connection between earth and sky. In other words, every brick and every step had meaning, much like the written symbols pressed into a clay tablet. Archaeologists have found that many of the ziggurat's bricks were stamped with short inscriptions. Each one carried the name of the king and a prayer line such as, "For Nana, his beloved Lord Namu, king of has built his temple." These words were repeated thousands of times, brick after brick, forming a pattern that turned the entire structure into a kind of written prayer. To build the temple was in a very real sense to write it into existence. This shows that the line between writing and architecture in Sumerian thought was very thin. When scribes wrote of raising the pure mountain, they were not just speaking poetically, they were describing the act of construction itself. We know much of this thanks to archaeology. In the 1920s and 30s, the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley led excavations at and uncovered the ziggurat's massive base and surviving stairways. He found layers of baked brick coated with bitumen to make the structure waterproof and durable. The ziggurat's sides were carefully aligned with the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. And later studies showed that its upper shrine was possibly aligned with the rising point of the moon at certain times of the year. This makes sense because the god Nana represented the moon. So the temple was not only a house for a god, but also a kind of calendar built in brick connecting the cycles of the heavens to the rituals of the earth. Some of the most revealing clues came from the inscriptions found nearby. Construction tablets and dedication plaques use almost the same phrases that appear in hymns and prayers. They speak of setting the foundation deep as the waters and making firm the summit where heaven meets earth. These are the same cosmic phrases Kramer had seen repeated in religious texts. This suggests that building was viewed as a sacred act. Each brick, each measurement, and each inscription was part of a ritual that kept the world in balance. To write and to build were two sides of the same act of creation. The scribes who invented thought. If the ziggurat was Sumer's most visible symbol of order, then the scribal schools were the invisible engines that made that order possible. They were the places where civilization was literally taught into existence, one wedge-shaped mark at a time. Every tablet, every law, every hymn, every tax record was born from the careful training of a small, tightly controlled group of people, the scribes. And while kings ruled by decree, it was the scribes who defined what those decrees actually meant. So, who were these people who taught a civilization how to think? Scribal training began early, often within families already part of the temple or administrative elite. Most students were boys, though a few examples of female scribes have been found. They started as young as 6 or 7, spending long days in what the Sumerians called the aduba or tablet house. The method was rigorous. The first task was to learn to make the clay itself, moist enough to hold a mark, but firm enough not to crumble. Then came the stylus, the reed cut at an angle to press the wedge shapes that formed ununiform. Students began by copying lists, long, dry sequences of words grouped by topic. One day might be a list of animals, the next of tools, the next of professions or plants. As students advanced, they moved to model texts, short administrative records or hymns that they would copy line by line from a teacher's tablet. Archaeologists have found paired tablets showing this process. One written neatly by the instructor, the other covered in a student's corrections and attempts. Recent studies from collections in the British Museum and digital archives like CDLY show that even small differences between teacher and student versions can reveal how knowledge was transmitted. One such pair, now in the Louvre, contains a hymn to the goddess Nisaba, the divine patron of writing, on one side, and an account of grain deliveries on the other. In other words, learning to keep accounts was also a lesson in maintaining divine order. Cuneiform itself made this worldview possible. Each sign could mean several things depending on its context. A single wedge mark might stand for a sound, a word, or even an idea. This means that writing in Sumer was not a one-to-one code, but a flexible system that demanded interpretation. The scribes alone knew how to read those layers of meaning. They could turn an ordinary record of brick shipments into a subtle reference to creation myths, or encode political messages in phrases that seemed just administrative. And this ability of the script gave scribes enormous power. Literacy in ancient Sumer was limited to a small fraction of the population, perhaps only 1 or 2%. Most citizens could neither read nor write, so scribes became the gatekeepers of knowledge. They recorded transactions, drafted contracts, copied royal decrees, and wrote prayers. They were the intermediaries between ruler and subject, between human and divine. In many cases, scribes came from the same families for generations, passing on both the technical skills and the social privilege that came with them. Tablets from cities like Ur and Nippur record names of scribes belonging to the same households across centuries. Their titles inherited much like property. This means that writing was not only a tool of record-keeping, but also a means of preserving status and power. This system gave them immense influence. A ruler could command armies, but a scribe could determine how that ruler would be remembered. The difference between becoming a legend and fading into nothingness often depended on who was writing the story. And because cuneiform signs allowed for hidden meanings, scribes could insert layers of interpretation invisible to anyone outside their circle. This means that when we talk about the birth of civilization, we are really talking about the birth of literacy, not as a skill, but as a way of thinking. And it was the scribes who taught humanity how to think in writing. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.